Welcome back. We just talked NBA, but now we're talking hockey. It's been a great NHL season so far, with Connor McDavid of the Oilers and Nathan MacKinnon of the Avalanche emerging as MVP frontrunners. I'm joined by Jerome Sweeney and Marina Seaver to debate who is the NHL MVP frontrunner.
Yeah, I don't know how the answer to this question is anyone other than Connor McDavid with the way that he has been playing this season. He is just out of his mind. He's on a different tier than it seems everyone around him, both on his team and otherwise. He leads the whole NHL with 28 points. He's scored 9 goals and 19 assists in I think 16 games, and has had 19 assists, not scored. And I just think he's just such an incredible player. And with hockey, it's a little bit different than a lot of other sports because yes, you have stats and stats matter. And McDavid's stats have him ahead of literally everyone else in the league right now. But also when you watch him play, there's a different level of his game that you understand that just goes to show why he is so incredibly valuable. He's the best skater in the league, I think, hands down. His playmaking ability is just insane. He's got great hands. He's super exciting on the rush, and centering that top line for the Oilers, he's just incredible in his production, especially considering what he has around him, which is not elite in the same way that the Avalanche is. And with Nathan MacKinnon, he has way better guys around him, and McDavid doesn't have that advantage. So if it comes to who brings more value to his respective team, I think McDavid is the easy answer, especially considering who he has around him compared to who Nathan MacKinnon has around him.
Right. And then, so it's kind of cool, we're in that period where we're seeing, the Ovechkin Crosby era sort of transition to the Eichel, McDavid, Matthews, McKinnon, Kucherov era. So it's been pretty interesting this season in particular with a lot of COVID injuries and whatnot. But I mean, Nathan MacKinnon is different than Connor McDavid for a couple different reasons. Yes, he is on the most elite line in the NHL with Mikko Rantanen and Gabriel Landeskog, and they all complement each other perfectly. There's no denying that is just an all-star top tier line. They're physical. They distribute the puck well. Colorado has a great defense. Had some inconsistencies with goalies throughout the season, but that should balance it out once Nathan MacKinnon comes back from his injury that he suffered 2 weeks ago. But I think genuinely it is hard to distinguish between those two players because, yes, the Avalanche have a better team surrounding MacKinnon, but Leon Draisaitl won the NHL MVP last year, and he's also right ahead in the NHL MVP race. So I would argue that McDavid might not even be the most valuable player on his team just because of what Leon Draisaitl can do with that second line. And then when McDavid coincidentally gets hurt about once a year for 2 to 3 weeks, it seems, Draisaitl steps up and he performs like an MVP. So I think there's obviously 3 top players, being McDavid, Draisaitl, and MacKinnon, but I think in the end of the day, it's definitely Draisaitl might be more valuable to the Oilers just because of his injury proneness.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not going to say that Draisaitl isn't, great centering that second line, because then that's 2 elite lines for, those 2 elite top units for the Oilers, just because of those guys that they have centering those lines. And if this were a conversation that we were having last year, I honestly think Nathan MacKinnon deserved to win the Hart Trophy last year over Draisaitl. So I think MacKinnon is an incredibly valuable player. And if we were having this debate last year, I would be taking MacKinnon's side over it, just because of how he put the Avalanche on his back in the playoffs with all of the injuries that they were dealing with, and his leadership and the way he stepped up. But we're not talking last year, we're talking this year. And I think if you are looking this year so far, McDavid versus MacKinnon, obviously the Avs have had some postponements due to COVID, and that has kind of worked in MacKinnon's favor, because it's not like he's missing ice time because of his injury for those 4 games. It's just because the whole team isn't able to get out on the ice. But I just think McDavid is just the MVP this year, and he brings so much more to his team than MacKinnon brings to the Avalanche, to the healthy Avalanche. And I don't know, he's just elite and MVP this year over a month into the season. I think it has to be McDavid.
Where I see the difference in that is, if you look back to the 07-08 time when Crosby, who McDavid gets compared to like no other, it's kind of like the LeBron James, Michael Jordan debate at this point. But, even with, the Penguins were not a great team when Crosby emerged into the league. but he was a game changer, and he immediately, with Evgeny Malkin, a great second line center similar to Draisaitl, they won Stanley Cups. They would be able to produce success. Nathan MacKinnon's same age as Connor McDavid, has brought his team into the playoffs consistently. They've won in the playoffs consistently. Connor McDavid can get the Oilers to the playoffs, but until they can move on in the playoffs, you're not really valuable to your team because you're the best player and you're the best skill player on the face of the earth, and you can't get to the Stanley Cup, which is the goal for the NHL.
Yeah, and I know Crosby and Malkin have really been compared to, the duo that McDavid and Draisaitl are, especially when they're out on the ice together, like part of that top power play unit, and how dynamic they are together. But I don't know. I think the NHL is kind of like baseball in the sense that it's different from the NBA because your stars can't have
You can't be a star every night.
impact. Exactly. It's like in baseball, if Mike Trout can't get the Angels to the playoffs, no one's going to get the Angels to the playoffs. And I think hockey is similar in that aspect. So is it all on McDavid's shoulders that the Oilers don't have a defense, that his line mates are weak, that their goaltending is below average? I don't think so. Yeah, he's the best skill player on the ice in literally any game that he plays in, just because I think he's the best active player in the league right now. But is the Oilers playoff misfortune, does that deserve to fall all on McDavid? I don't think so. And again, we'll have to see this year, because we're talking Hart Trophy this year, how the playoff picture turns out and what the Oilers can do, and potentially how the Avs. I think the Avs are going to make the playoffs. I think that goes without saying. So at this point, we're just waiting to see what Edmonton can do. But I don't know. Yeah, the Oilers have suffered some playoff misfortune, but they don't have a team around them like the Avs do. McDavid isn't playing with guys around him like MacKinnon has at his disposal, and I think that is what separates them.
Last season, we saw MacKinnon put the team on his back.
Yeah.
Right. And then, so do we think that Connor McDavid has the ability to do something similar to what Nathan MacKinnon did last season, where you lose Mikko Rantanen for 30 games, Gabriel Landeskog for 16 games throughout a season. Your team's leading scorer by 43 points. So he literally put the team on his back. And then if McDavid can do something similar to that, even with Leon Draisaitl taking half the load of the offense away from him, yes, but until then, what makes LeBron James the MVP is night in and night out, he comes up and shows out. And like you said, hockey, stats don't always show up, but McKinnon's out there, he's orchestrating the offense every night, much like McDavid. But end of the day, it's just team success means a lot more in hockey than it does in everything else, because it's hard to pinpoint individual success in a large team sport where you're out on the ice for 45 seconds at a time.
Yeah. And I mean, again, if we're having this conversation last year about last season, I think MacKinnon deserved the trophy because, again, we talk about he put the team on his back. And that's kind of a theme with a lot of recent Hart Trophy winners like Taylor Hall and what I think it was 2018, like got that award hands down because of what he did in the playoffs, put his team on his back. So again, I do see the value in that. But even with all of those injuries that MacKinnon was dealing with last year, they still had better defensemen. They still have a weapon like Cale Makar. They still had more lights out goaltending. Grubauer was pretty solid all through the playoffs. And again, those are things that the Oilers, not only did they not have last year, but they also don't have this year. So yeah, you have McDavid and Draisaitl, but other than that, the Oilers don't have around them what the Avs do. And so then the question is MacKinnon more valuable to the Avalanche than McDavid is to the Oilers? And I don't think the answer to that question is yes. And because we're talking most valuable player, I think right now, because not only is McDavid the best player in the league right now, and this year has he been the best, but he is inherently more valuable to the Oilers than I think MacKinnon is to the Avs. Not to take away from MacKinnon, but if that's the debate that we're framing and the conversation that we're having, I think the answer has to be McDavid.
Well, I want to thank you guys both for joining us. Everyone get on Sided and pick who you think is going to be the NHL's MVP. We're going to take a quick commercial break and we'll be back to talk more NBA.